Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Joining us now, Sarah Lazare, editor of Workday Magazine, contributing editor at In These Times, who has done a deep dive into not only the sort of like the dynamic between the UAW and Stellantis, specifically around this plant in Belvidere, Illinois, but also the workers and the community that is around this plant and how they've been impacted by the closing of the plant, then the promise to reopen the plant, and then what looks like sort of a hedging or a backing out of a deal. So, Sarah, welcome to the program. Just give us a history of this Stellantis plant in Belvedere.
The Stellantis plant in Belvedere has been operating since 1965, most recently making the Jeep Cherokee. It idled in March 2023, and during UAW's stand-up strike out on the picket lines, that really became a symbol of the corporate greed of Stellantis, the company that was formerly called Chrysler. People talked about how the town had been utterly devastated by the idling, which made it incredibly stunning news that through the UAW stand-up strike, the workers won the reopening of the plant. That's actually never been done before. It's unprecedented for at the bargaining table through a strike to win the reopening of a plant that has closed. There are examples of unions sort of negotiating plants staying open, but never reopening a closed plant. This is according to Joshua Murray, a sociology professor who I interviewed for my piece. So this was amazing news. It was really a lifeline for the community of Belvidere, a town of 25,000 people that had really been devastated by the idling. When I visited last January in a piece that I did for Workday Magazine and In These Times, when I talked to workers, they said they were cautiously optimistic. They were excited and hopeful, but they wouldn't really believe it until they saw dirt being moved, concrete being poured. And just to be clear, so the UAW won 3 things in the contract. So one was the establishment of a mega hub parts distribution center in 2024. And then in 2027, resuming mid-sized vehicle production. And then in 2028, a new electric battery plant. So those are the commitments that Stellantis contractually agreed to.
How many workers are we talking about were employed in this plant and were left without work in the wake of it going idle?
So 1,300 people were put out of work by the idling in 2023, but that doesn't reflect the full numbers. So back in 2019 at its height, Local 1268 had around 7,000 members if you include suppliers. And that included 4,500 inside the plant. And then we saw those numbers erode over time. The cuts started before the official idling of the plant.
And we should say, this is out of a town of 25,000. I mean, that's you're almost talking about a third of the town was reliant on that plant in one form or another. I mean, directly reliant on that plant in one form or another. I mean, who knows, the sort of knock-on impacts, but it seems like there probably was nobody in that town who didn't know multiple people who worked at that plant. All right. What was Stellantis like? What was their argument as to why the plant closed? And why do the workers get to dictate what the business plans are for this car manufacturer?
So this is the question UAW is asking, but sort of turning it on its head and testing a hypothesis, which is, what if workers don't have to be subject to the whims of corporations? And what if workers don't have to just pick up and leave their families, their towns, when a CEO says it's time to do that? What if workers can actually have a say in the manufacturing decisions that affect and shape their lives? Stellantis, so just to sort of continue the plot line of what's been happening. So when I went back there a couple of weeks ago, I found that unfortunately, workers' fears had come to pass. Stellantis, in an August 20th statement, announced that it was delaying plans to reopen. It cited, quote unquote, market conditions. UAW's response to that is, well, if market conditions are so bad, why did the CEO, Carlos Tavares, get a 56% raise, bringing him to a total compensation of $39.5 million, now making him the highest paid Detroit auto executive. I
want to just sort of let that marinate for a little bit. The guy gets a 56% raise on market conditions that are presumably impacting all the car companies, right? I mean, if it's a market condition, definitionally, and somehow he managed to get a raise. I don't, you might have a better sense of this. His compensation isn't tied to the stock value, would it be? And that stock value is not tied towards the ability to cut labor costs.
You know, Carlos Tavares getting that raise is not only baffling to workers in Belvedere, but makes them really, really angry. It's pretty deeply personal. You know, I talked to two women, Dawn Sims and Trina Holmes. They have both been at the plant their entire adult lives. They're 5 years from their retirement. While they're out of work, they can't accumulate points for their pensions. So that means if they walked away now, they'd face a significant reduction to that benefit. They are really angry about Carlos Tavares getting a raise. It is pretty deeply felt. So I will say that one thing workers did win in their contract, in addition to the reopening and to the investment in new manufacturing operations in Belvedere, they also won something called subpay, where they get 74% of their pay at 40 hours. They also get health coverage. They don't get dental. And so, you know, this is something that they won through their union, and it helps, but it's really not enough. You know, there are a few things to consider. A lot of people were bringing in overtime hours. You don't get those. They don't get cost of living adjustments. They don't get raises. But then also there's just this big question of what's happening in my future. A lot of people have kids who are in high school, and they're asking themselves questions like, do I need to pull my kid out of high school and move to a different plant? Or is that too cruel to my kid, and should I separate from my child and have them stay with someone else so that they can finish high school with their friends? You know, I talk to people who can't even discuss these issues without crying and getting choked up. So the level of pain and insult people feel about this pay gap with the CEO is really visceral. And I can also talk a little bit, you know, so there are thousands of people impacted. You know, you mentioned that it represents a lot of people in Belvedere. There are also a lot of people from surrounding towns that work for either the plant or suppliers. You know, some of those people, when they were cut, they took buyout packages. Some of them just quit. You know, there are around 945 people currently on subpay when you include both local 1268 and a separate Naperville local. There was some consolidation that happened. But, you know, there are many people who were just cut loose. When I was in Belvedere a couple of weeks ago, I just walked into a food pantry. It was 2:30 p.m. They had just run out of food for the day, and they very kindly talked to me about how the plant idling has impacted the town. I was told that need measurably went up and goes up every time there's a shift at the plant, that the closure measurably increased the people who are in need of food assistance, and that at least some of those people are people who formerly worked in the auto industry, whether directly for Stellantis or suppliers, but also the ripple effects are immense. And I also walked into a Salvation Army, and I talked with their social services director, and she told me that she had personally worked with 10 families made homeless as a direct result of the closure.
So what is like the contractual obligations? Because, well, you know, just before we came out, and I guess it was last night, Sean Fain said that they were going to hold a strike authorization vote. But before we get to that, like, what are, like, I mean, this was a negotiated, regardless of the lack of precedent for a union saying, negotiating successfully for a reopening of a plant, and obviously how desperately it needs it, and the market conditions, whatnot. Like, this was a contractual agreement. Like, what from a legal perspective only, is there any action that the UAW can take? Or is there enough wiggle room that the legal action's probably not worth it, or it could take too long? And the idea is like, we're not messing around. We're just going to exercise where our power lies.
So there are a few things. So first of all, UAW has filed federal charges against Stellantis for lack of transparency around information related to its investment commitments. Also, something really important to know about the contract that was won through the stand-up strike, UAW members have the right to strike over investment and product decisions. That's what they won in the contract. It was pretty notable. You don't see that in every contract. And so what the UAW is doing is a pretty novel strategy. I mean, workers in Belvidere, they can't strike. They have no labor to withhold. Their problem is that they are out of work. So what UAW is doing in its contract, it says that through a grievance procedure, workers can, as one step of that, if they fulfilled certain steps, they can go on strike. So what Sean Fain announced last night in his live stream is that as of now, 28 different locals have started the grievance process. At least one of those is planning on a strike vote in the coming days. So the idea is that a strike is not preordained, but these workers are taking steps so that if they decide one is necessary, a potential national strike is one possibility. And
national strike against Stellantis specifically, right? I mean,
not the around Belvedere. So UAW. Oh, sorry. Yeah, against
Stellantis. All right. I mean, so it's not UAW workers working for GM or for Ford who would engage in that strike, but specifically ones that work for Stellantis in other parts of the country, at other plants, whatnot.
Exactly. Yeah. So 28 locals that represent members who work for Stellantis. And UAW's position is that Stellantis has broken the contract. And if they can come for Belvedere, they can come after anything else that was won in the contract. Belvedere was a really big victory for the union. And clearly it has to be defended. And that's how they talked about it at the time. So, we're looking at, a potentially really big work stoppage. So Stellantis's reply to UAW is that there's a carve out in the contract that says you can make changes based on market conditions. So they're claiming market conditions. And then UAW's response to that is, if market conditions are so bad, why is your CEO getting this giant raise? And if market conditions are so bad, how come Ford and GM aren't seeing a slump in sales? And ultimately, UAW's position is that corporate greed and poor decisions being made by the CEO and by executives are responsible for quote unquote market conditions. And Sean Fain said something to the effect of, how come market conditions are always used to stiffen auto worker? How come it's market conditions for thee, but not for me?
And we should be clear too. I think market conditions are distinct from how Stellantis is performing within the context of those market conditions. But is there a precedent for this? I mean, there's sort of a quality, the idea of these are workers who are theoretically completely unimpacted directly by what happens in Belvedere, right? Because the workers who are working at other places, it's people who are not working in Belvedere who are impacted. But is there a precedent for this in recent labor history of a union striking based upon supporting workers who are no longer like working at a place?
Workers taking action and taking risks to support other workers, there's a long history of that.
Sure.
And actually, when you asked that question, one thing that immediately came to mind is that in 2019, GM workers in Mexico actually struck in solidarity with striking U.S. workers, some of them facing retaliation for doing so. But as far, and when you talk to workers in Belvedere, they're really glad that other locals are willing to fight for them. They don't see it as charity. It's generally not framed as charity. There's actually direct personal interest because a few things. So first, if Stellantis can violate the contract towards Belvedere, it can violate anyone's contract.
Right.
But then secondly, that was something they won in negotiations. And when you win things in negotiations, that means you leave other things on the table. So if that was one of their big wins and then it's taken away, it means those sacrifices were for nothing. One thing, but in terms of whether it's unprecedented, I think this whole situation, so according to Joshua Murray, the sociology professor I interviewed, this whole situation is pretty unprecedented if they're successful, if they reopen the plant. One thing I did want to mention is, so when I was in Belvidere, I had conversations with one worker, Dawn Sims. She is a longtime assembly plant worker. She was 5 years from retirement. Now her future is in limbo. We talked about the fact that after the plant idled, plants in Mexico picked up production of the Jeep Cherokee. And one thing that she told me is, I want workers in Mexico to be paid well. I'm not against any worker in Mexico. I don't want anyone to lose their jobs. I think there's enough for everyone. And UAW has this broader Mexico solidarity program under the leadership of Sean Fain, who came in as a reform challenger. And through the Mexico Solidarity Project, UAW is providing direct material support for independent unions, sort of based on the idea that it's not us versus them, but you improve everyone's paying conditions by improving everyone's paying conditions, and that the real culprit is corporate greed and these trade policies that really harm both U.S. and Mexican workers.
What is the timeline? I mean, if the what do we have a sense of when these votes are going to be? The strike authorization votes are going to happen, and generally, let's say the vote comes down in favor of or providing that strike authorization. Does Fain then say to Stellantis, "Okay, you got 14 days, or you got 7 days, or I'm not going to tell you when we start," or something like that?
There are a variety of steps they need to fulfill. I don't have the exact timelines for you, and I don't actually think that it's publicly known at this point what the strategy is. Like I said, it's not preordained that there will be a strike, but they're taking steps so that if workers think there needs to be one, then they're able to do that. But in turn, it's not going to be like a tomorrow thing.
Right.
But once you start having strike votes, then that'll give us a little more information about timeline. But there are several steps involved in the grievance process. And then I think that, UAW is hoping that there can be some kind of public pressure campaign to get Stellantis to follow through on its commitments. I did reach out to Stellantis when reporting this article, and I asked them if they could provide me an alternate timetable, because their statements just said Belvedere has been delayed with no specificity. And when I asked for an alternate timetable, they said we have nothing to provide at this time. And I told them that I had spoken with various members of the community who are really suffering. I told them about the homelessness. I told them about increased need at the food pantry. They gave me a really pat response for every single thing that I mentioned. All they said was workers are receiving sub pay and healthcare, and we know this is hard on communities. but that's all they said. And, like no one is debating that workers are getting sub pay. That's something that they won through their union. It's something they won by going on strike. The issue is that this has a ripple effect. I went to an Italian pizzeria and bakery, and I just walked up to the counter and I asked the owner how it was affecting business to have the plant idled. I went there because workers said that was one place they used to go out to eat or get deliveries to the plant. And she said that she's really feeling it and that it's hard to even know how far the impact goes.
In a town that small, there's no way when 1/3 of the population is basically out of work over the course of a couple of years that everyone isn't impacted in some way or another. But the piece is a really great piece, and we're going to link to it at majority.fm. Sarah Lazare, editor, Workday Magazine, and contributing editor in these times. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.